27 years. He's the president of his block club. He's also the vice president of his neighborhood association. Mr. Russ also has worked for the water department for 15 years. A couple of positions, one of them being as a worker and another as a skills trade teacher. Right? So he has a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge about the things that are happening in Detroit, but more importantly, he can give us a clear understanding about what's happening with the residents in these massive water shutoffs.
I'm ready to talk.
You're ready to talk?
I'm ready to talk.
Well,
tell the story.
It's all yours. Go right ahead, please.
Well, you know, we've had a water department owned by the city of Detroit since 1842. You know, it's in other words, it's 170 some years old.
Yeah.
And so years ago, Detroit decided that they would honor the request from various suburban communities to build the water system well outside of Detroit into the whole region, because a lot of cities were losing water because their wells were going dry. They didn't have water sources, and they asked Detroit to build water mains out to their cities and supply their cities and their homes. And Detroit did that in the 1950s, especially. That was the big period. And so Detroit did it, and after Detroit did it, the suburbs started saying they wanted to take control of the city. Of the city's water department, you know, and so what we're dealing with today is with the Governor Snyder having taken over control of the city. He's trying to use his control position through the bankruptcy court to turn the water department over to the suburbs. And one of the things he's doing is trying to work a deal either with the suburbs or with a private company that he would sell the water department to. I mean, Snyder acts as if this is actually his water department. It's not. It's the people's water department.
It's a non-profit, isn't it?
It's totally non-profit. In fact, when the water department was collecting revenues and getting surpluses, by law and by practice, they rebated that money the following year so that they never had a surplus. They never had money in the bank, if you will. It was always being rebated back if there was an excess. Okay, and so the water department exists solely to provide public health service of clean, safe drinking water. And
can you say that a little bit louder so that the public can hear exactly what you're saying? Because that needs to be very clear.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The sole purpose of the water department is to The sole purpose of the water department is to provide safe, clean, healthy drinking water to its residents, its customers, and to provide sanitary services so that waste can flow away and not cause public health problems. So, at any rate, it doesn't exist to make money for suburbs. It doesn't exist to make money for city politicians. It doesn't exist to make money for private companies. Before the water department started using modern technology in Detroit 100 years ago, thousands of people a year died from waterborne diseases because the water wasn't properly treated. Detroit built the world's largest treatment plant in 1917 and started filtering and treating the water, and the disease rate dropped off. When they started adding chlorine to the water, it ended all these waterborne diseases. And Detroit has built 4 more major pump plants since then to contribute to the load. They serve about 4 million people in the region. In other words, about 40% of the state of Michigan gets their water from the city of Detroit. And that was their choice to do that. Nobody imposed it and said, you've got to do this. You know, so when they complain about the rates, they always have to look at the alternative. The fact of the matter is, in research...
Who complain about the rates?
Anybody, actually.
Okay.
But Detroiters and others do have some legitimate complaints about water rates, and I'll get to that. But in general, even before those complaints existed, people complained about them. And if you compared us to national averages, we were always low on the national averages. And we had one large, efficient system. And, you know, when you took the fact that it took water out of the river or out of Lake Huron and cleaned it and treated it and delivered it right to your kitchen or your bathroom, you know, you were getting a pretty good deal, you know. And that was the only water you could ever get that was safe and certified as safe. Even bottled water to this day is uncertified, and, you know, labs have shown that there's bacteria in bottled water.
In the bottled water.
Yeah. So, you know, this really is a good deal. But, you know, in recent years, there have been a number of contracts. The federal court got very involved because in 1977, the federal government said that they were polluting the river by dumping sewage into the river. So they had to do something. So a federal judge supervised the case, and as he was involved in the case, he started taking more and more power for himself, to a point where he took over the whole water department with things that had nothing to do with the sanitary issues that prompted the lawsuit. So at that point, the parts of city government were completely cut out, like city council and so forth. And they started running contracts through the court that citizens didn't even know about, and in my mind had no justification. I remember one that was done in 2005 for $150 million, and that was just for Detroit residents to pay. It was for putting new water meter systems into homes. There was no need for this contract, but so those are the things I think Detroiters have a legitimate complaint about. You know, because that added 20. I'm trying to remember. For the next 30 years, it meant $22 a year added to your water bill for every resident at the time it was done. Now, that means really for many of us, just about most of our lives. You know, if you're, you know, going to be paying in your Detroit water bill. Now, that if you take that and compound it with other kinds of contracts that were being done, through the court, you know, it winds up adding to your water bill.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, you had a lot of contractors that were benefiting from this, but to me, it was a liability for the residents. So I've always complained about that.
If you fast forward to today, you know, right now, those fees are still on the bills that people are responsible for right now today, and the majority of the bulk of the bill isn't even so much the water usage, but the sewer usage. Right.
It's much more expensive to treat sewage than it is to treat water out of the Detroit River. It's a much bigger sanitary issue. All the sewage flows to one plant in southwest Detroit where all the treatment occurs, and it's the largest single-site sewage plant in the entire world. And they have to make sure that once they treat the water and they put the water back into the river, that it's safe, it's bacteria-free, and it won't be filled with chemicals and metals and so forth. Because, you know, in addition to what people flush down a toilet or run down a sink, you have people dumping stuff in sewers.
Yes.
Metals and toxic things and oils and all sorts of things. And the water department has to take all that stuff out. You know, that's their job. And so it is expensive because it involves huge machinery and huge processes and all sorts of things. So, at any rate, it takes that's why the charges are there. But I still have questions as to whether the funds that they're collecting, you know, whether the contracts that were being done under the court order were necessary contracts for that purpose, whether there was a more efficient, cost-effective way of doing this treatment. And that's still an open question in my mind, based on my discussion with experts in wastewater treatment. I worked in freshwater treatment, and there were contracts going through there that none of us thought were necessary. And we took our job seriously. We took the freshwater system seriously, but you didn't need some of the control systems that they were putting in place, because water treatment is a very slow process. If it flows from a river to a tunnel, goes into the plant, and it'll take up to half a day to go through the plant to get treated and filtered and all that. So, it's not like you need instant controls like that, everything is slow and deliberate. And so they started putting things in place that were expensive and unnecessary, and we're paying for all that on our water bills. And so the consequence of all these decisions, of all these many contracts that were over $100 million each, or a couple $100 million, is that we've got water bills now that are a burden to the people. And if somebody wants to come up with a plan for full employment of Detroiters, where people can get good paying jobs and everybody's employed, then this issue,
wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, that's right. This issue would go away. But basically business has disinvested from Detroit, pulled jobs out of Detroit, and then you get rhetoric. You get rhetoric from people saying, Detroit's not doing what it's supposed to do. Well, the world is undercutting Detroit in many ways.
Absolutely.
The banks, the large industrial employers,
the Board of Education.
The Board of Education is not the problem in my view, because the problem is the emergency managers being imposed over it.
Absolutely.
12 of the
That's what I should have said. Thank you.
Yep. 12 of the last 15 years, the state of Michigan has controlled the Detroit public schools. And before they took control, they took a district that had $100 million surplus and drove it into a couple $100 million of deficit. The state of Michigan control has been the biggest single factor in destroying education in Detroit, by far. In fact, in the 1990s, the data shows that the academic scores were going up in Detroit public schools, the enrollment was going up in Detroit public schools, and again, in 1999, when they took it over, they had a $93 million net surplus. And so there was no need for a takeover. But the reason they did the takeover is because they wanted the bond construction money that the school board controlled.
$1 billion?
$1.5 billion. 1.5 billion. Yeah.
How much you think is left?
None.
No?
No. In fact, when the state took control again in 2009, they put another $500 million bond on. So we've paid $2 billion in construction bonds. And it was ridiculous because the state was closing schools the whole time they were spending the money to build new schools.
Yes.
The purpose was to give contractors outside of Detroit, for the most part, like Barton Mallow, huge contracts.